She ran from the man who spent 4 years convincing her she was nothing and ran straight into the arms of the most dangerous man in Chicago. One desperate kiss in a dark hallway. One split second that neither of them could take back. And now the woman who had spent years making herself small was standing at the center of a war she never saw coming. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is only getting started. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The dress was a mistake. Alara Whitmore knew it the moment she stepped out of the cab and felt the October wind cut through the thin fabric like it had a grudge. She stood on the sidewalk outside the Drake Hotel with both hands pressing the hem of her skirt against her thighs, watching the other guests move through the entrance in their furs and tailored everything, and she thought, I should go home. She didn't go home. She had been telling herself for 3 weeks that she could do this, that walking into a room full of people who knew Caleb Voss, who had attended his birthday parties, who had clinked glasses with him at charity events, who had smiled politely while he said cruel things to her in public and called it a joke, that walking into that room was proof she had survived him, that she was still standing, that the 2 years since she had finally packed her things and left while he was in a meeting had changed her in ways that counted. She was 31 years old. She had a job she was good at. She paid her own rent. She slept without dreading the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She told herself these things the way a person in cold water tells themselves to keep kicking. Inside, the Drake's Grand Ballroom was everything she expected and nothing she was ready for. Crystal chandeliers threw warm gold light across a room full of Chicago's quietly powerful, the kind of wealthy that didn't need to announce itself, the kind that wore its money the way other people wore skin. A string quartet played in the corner. Someone had put white orchids everywhere. The whole thing smelled like money and old wood and someone's very expensive perfume. Alara took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and kept moving, because stopping felt like a target. She was there for the firm. Hartley and Associates had sent 3 of their senior accountants as guests of a client, a development company that had underwritten most of the evening. Alara's name had been on the list by accident, she suspected. Her colleague Jess had come down with something on Thursday, and rather than leave a seat empty, their manager had called Alara with 6 hours' notice. She had said yes before she thought it through. That was the problem with her, even now. She said yes before she thought it through. For the first 40 minutes, things were manageable. She found the other 2 accountants from her firm, Greg, who was already on his 3rd drink, and Naomi, who was deep in conversation with someone from the client's legal team. And she stood near them without really participating, which was its own kind of comfort. She ate 1 piece of bruschetta. She watched the room. And then she saw him. Caleb Voss hadn't changed. That was the first thing she registered, and it hit her somewhere below the ribs, an almost physical sensation. The recognition that the person who had done the most damage to her was still standing upright, still wearing that particular shade of charcoal gray he favored, still carrying himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved to be in any room he entered. He was laughing. His hand was on the shoulder of a man Alara didn't recognize. The laugh was the one she knew, the one that said, I am the most important person at this table. And even from 40 feet away, the sound of it made her stomach drop. She turned before he could see her. Her first instinct was Naomi. Naomi was solid, practical, would understand immediately without being asked to explain why. But Naomi had moved deeper into the crowd, and Alara couldn't see her anymore. Greg was at the bar, talking too loudly. No use. She set her water glass down on the nearest surface, someone's abandoned table setting, and started moving toward the edge of the room. There were doors along the far wall, service exits, corridors that led somewhere quieter, somewhere without Caleb Voss, and the accumulated weight of 4 years she had spent learning not to trust her own perceptions. She was almost at the doors when she heard his voice behind her. Alara. 1 word, just her name. The way he said it, like he was correcting her for something she hadn't done yet, made every muscle in her back tighten. She pushed through the nearest door. The corridor on the other side was dim and carpeted and smelled of cleaning products and something floral from a diffuser near the ceiling. Service staff used this stretch between the ballroom and the kitchen. Right now, it was empty. The sounds of the gala dropped to a muffled hum the moment the door swung shut behind her. Alara pressed herself against the wall and breathed. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. She hated that. She had worked so hard, 2 years of learning to be in a room without scanning it for his mood, without measuring her words before she spoke them, without bracing for something she couldn't name. And one glimpse of him from across a crowded room, and her body was responding like she hadn't learned anything at all. That was the cruelest part of what he had done to her. He hadn't had to touch her tonight. He hadn't even had to speak to her. Just the sight of him was enough to send her nervous system back into the patterns it had spent years building. She pressed both palms flat against the wall and focused on the texture of the wallpaper. Real, solid, present. Then the service door at the far end of the corridor opened, and Caleb walked through it. He wasn't even hurrying. That was the thing about Caleb. He never hurried, because he had never once believed that something he wanted would simply leave before he arrived. He walked the length of the dim corridor with his jacket button still fastened and his expression mild, as though he had followed her in from a conversation and she had simply stepped away for a moment. "You look good," he said. She didn't answer. "That's a nice dress." A pause. "A little tight across the... Don't." The word came out before she planned it. Her voice was steadier than she felt, and that surprised her. He tilted his head. That was another thing she remembered, the head tilt. He did it when he thought she was being interesting, which usually meant he thought she was being naive. "I'm just saying, you look good. That's a compliment. Can you not even accept a compliment anymore without making it something?" The sentence landed exactly the way he had always intended his sentences to land, off balance, slightly her fault. "I'm going back inside," Alara said. "We should talk." "No." "Alara." His voice dropped, got softer, which was always worse than the loud version. 2 years. I think we can have a conversation. I think we've earned that." She moved a step around him. He shifted without appearing to shift, the way he always had, and suddenly she was closer to the wall and he was between her and the far door, not blocking her technically, just occupying the space. "You left without even having a real conversation," he said. "You know that's always bothered me, that you couldn't just talk to me like an adult. Caleb, I've changed. I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking you to hear that. I've been in a better place. The people in my life have noticed." He paused. "You were always so sensitive. I used to think that was the problem, but I've started to understand it was more complicated than that." Something turned over in her chest. Not quite anger and not quite grief, something exhausted and corrosive and very, very tired. "You used to tell me I was too sensitive every time I had a feeling you didn't want to deal with," Alara said. His expression flickered, just slightly. "That's not fair. It's accurate. You always had to be right about everything, didn't you?" And there it was, the shift that used to take 30 minutes in a fight, the pivot from soft to something that had an edge underneath it. It had taken 30 seconds tonight. Maybe he had changed, just not in the direction he thought. "You know what your problem is, Alara. You take everything I say and you make it into something it isn't, and then you're shocked when people can't reach you." People. Not I. People. She had an MBA. She was a senior accountant at a firm that handled 9-figure accounts. She had spent 4 years in this man's orbit being told, in dozens of different ways and tones and moments, that she was difficult, sensitive, hard to love, that her instincts were wrong, that her read on situations was off, that anyone else would have walked away long before he had stayed. She looked at him now, really looked at him, in the dim corridor of a hotel where she had come to prove something to herself. And she felt the particular clarity that sometimes arrives on the other side of fear. He was just a man. A frightened, controlling man who had discovered early that making other people doubt themselves was easier than doing his own work. She wasn't afraid of him. She was angry. "I'm leaving," Alara said. She moved past him this time. He caught her arm, not violently, not yet, the way it had always been in those early moments, just firmly enough to make her stop, and said, low and close, "You don't get to decide that. We're not done." And Alara heard in those words every conversation she had not been allowed to end, every room she had not been permitted to leave, Every moment in 4 years when she had been told her own timing was wrong, her own sense of completion was premature, her own needs were inconvenient. She was pulling her arm free when the door at the far end of the corridor opened again. No service staff this time. The man who stepped through was not a member of hotel staff. He was not a guest in the ordinary sense of the word. He was tall and still in the way that certain men are still, not the stillness of relaxation, but the stillness of a person who has made peace with the idea that the world around them is moving and they are not required to move with it. Dark suit, no tie, the jacket of some material that absorbed the corridor's dim light rather than reflecting it. He was perhaps mid-30s, with a face that had been arranged by genetics into something striking, and then been lived in hard enough to give it weight. He was flanked by two men who stayed just at the edge of the light, and the way they positioned themselves, behind him, never beside him, said something specific about the nature of his relationship to other people. He looked at Caleb's hand on Alara's arm. He looked at Alara. He looked back at Caleb. "Let her go," he said. His voice was quiet enough that she had to focus to hear it, and that quiet was somehow worse than volume. Caleb's grip tightened fractionally, the instinct of a man who does not like being redirected. "This is a private conversation. I can see that." "Then keep walking." The man did not keep walking. He stood in the corridor with his hands loose at his sides, and the two men behind him did not move, and the silence stretched until Alara could feel it pressing against her skin. "I'm going to say it once more," the man said. Caleb released her arm. She didn't know if he let go because he processed the situation correctly or because something in the man's voice had communicated something below the level of words. It didn't matter. Her arm was free, and she was stepping sideways, away from Caleb, toward the wall. The man's eyes moved to her. "Are you all right?" The question was direct and without performance. Not, "Can I help you?" Not, "Is everything okay?" Not the social formulas people used when they didn't actually want to be involved. Just, "Are you all right?" She nodded once, though her hands were shaking. "Good," he said. Caleb found his voice again from somewhere. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The man turned his gaze back to Caleb with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been easier to read, easier to respond to. It was something colder and more settled than that. "No," he said. "That's your problem. You have no idea who you're dealing with." One of the men behind him said something, quiet, leaning forward to speak near the man's ear. The man nodded once without looking at him. "My car is outside," he said, to no one in particular, and then very specifically to Alara. "If you'd like to not be in this building anymore." She should have said no. She understood that. She was a woman with a functioning brain who had spent 2 years learning to make better choices than the ones Caleb Voss had made for her. And walking out of a hotel with a stranger who had just materialized from the dark with two large men behind him was not, by any objective measure, a better choice. She looked at Caleb. She looked at the door. "Yes," she said. They walked out through the service exit into the cold October night, and Alara hadn't yet asked his name. And he hadn't offered it, and there was a black car waiting at the curb with the engine already running. It was only when they were inside, when the car door had closed and the hotel and Caleb Voss and the gala had all receded behind tinted glass, that she realized she was still shaking, and that the stranger sitting 3 feet from her in the back seat of a car she hadn't chosen was watching the city slide past the window with the calm of a man who owned it. "Thank you," she said, because she had manners, even when she had nothing else. "Don't thank me yet," he said. She looked at him. "What's your name?" He turned from the window and looked at her with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, just present, just completely and absolutely there, and said, "Lucien Devereaux." The name hit her like a current. She knew that name. Everyone in Chicago with a professional life and a passing interest in the way power moved through the city knew that name. She had heard it at the firm, from partners who went quiet when it came up, from a client who had once mentioned a Devereaux contract with the particular care of a man handling something he didn't want to drop. She had read it in a Tribune article she had dismissed as sensationalism about the city's shadow economy. She stared at the man sitting across from her in the dim back seat and understood, with a clarity that arrived too late to help her, exactly what category of mistake she had just made. and the car was already moving, and the city lights were already streaking past the windows, and Lucien Devereaux was watching her face with the patience of a man who had seen this exact moment of recognition before and had never once been troubled by it. "You're about to ask me if you should be scared," he said. She said nothing. "That's usually the smarter response," he said, and turned back to the window. Alara sat in the silence of that moving car and stared at her own reflection in the glass beside her, at the woman in the too thin dress who had run from one dangerous man and stepped directly into the orbit of another, and thought, "What have you done?" What she did not know, could not know yet, was that 3 miles away, Caleb Voss was already on his phone. That the two men who had flanked Lucien Devereaux in that corridor had photographed him leaving with her. That by morning, the information would have moved through certain networks the way information always does in cities built on competing power, fast and purposeful, and with a specific destination in mind. She did not know that the moment she had said yes and walked through that service exit, she had stopped being an ordinary accountant with a painful history and had become something else entirely. She had become the woman who left with Lucien Devereaux. And in this city, that was not a thing you could simply become and then unbecome when it turned out to be inconvenient. The car ride lasted 11 minutes. Alara knew because she counted. Not deliberately. It was the thing her brain did when it had no other way to hold itself together. The accountant's reflex. The need to put numbers to things that otherwise had no shape. 11 minutes of city lights smearing past tinted glass. 11 minutes of sitting 3 feet from a man whose name had just rearranged something in her understanding of the evening. 11 minutes of her own breathing, which she was trying to keep quiet and failing. Lucien Devereaux did not speak again. He sat with one arm resting along the door panel and his attention aimed out the window, and he had the quality, rare in Alara's experience, of being entirely comfortable with silence. Not performing comfort, not the studied ease of someone who had learned to seem unbothered, actually unbothered in the way that people are when they have decided, at some fundamental level, that most things are not worth the effort of being bothered by. This did not make her feel better. The car stopped in front of a building on North Michigan Avenue that she recognized without knowing its name. The kind of building that didn't need a name on the exterior because the people who needed to know what it was already knew. The driver opened her door. She got out because sitting in the car indefinitely was not a viable option. The lobby was marble and low light, and a security desk with 2 men behind it who looked at Lucien and didn't look at her, which told her that people arriving with him at this hour was not a thing that required documentation or comment. They took an elevator that required a key. The floor it stopped on had one door. Inside, the apartment was enormous and almost aggressively understated. Dark furniture, high ceilings, a wall of windows that showed Chicago from a height that made it look like a circuit board. All organized light, all pattern, no clutter. Nothing personal on the surfaces except a glass of water on the kitchen counter that someone had left there and not finished. A man was already inside, standing near the windows with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He was perhaps 50, with a gray-streaked beard and the particular posture of someone who had learned to be useful before he learned to be comfortable. He looked at Alara with the expression of a man who had been briefed on something and found the reality of it more complicated than the briefing. "This is Marcus," Lucien said, setting his own jacket over the back of a chair. "He runs my security." Marcus said nothing. His eyes moved over Alara the way a person reads a document, looking for the thing that matters, the clause that changes everything. "I'm not," Alara started. "Sit down," Lucien said. Not harshly, like a man who said things once and waited to see if once was enough. She sat. The couch was the kind of furniture that cost more than her monthly rent and felt like it. "Caleb Voss," Lucien said, standing at the window with his back half turned to the room. "Tell me about him." "That's not... Why do you need to know about him?" Lucien turned from the window. "Because in 20 minutes I'm going to know anyway. And I'd rather hear it from you first." Alara looked at Marcus, who had not moved. She looked back at Lucien. "We were engaged 4 years ago. I ended it 2 years ago." "Why?" The word landed flat and direct and without the usual social cushioning people wrapped around a question like that. "No, if you don't mind me asking." "No, you don't have to answer that." Because he spent 4 years making me feel like I was the problem in my own life, she said. And one day I ran the numbers and the math didn't work. Something shifted in Lucian's expression. Not warmth, but she wasn't sure he did warmth as a general practice, but a kind of attention. The quality of his focus changed. He followed you into that corridor. Yes. That's not the first time he's done something like that. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. No. Lucian looked at Marcus. Some communication passed between them that had no words. Marcus pulled out his phone and moved toward the far end of the apartment. You can stay here tonight, Lucian said. Alara stood up. I don't need... There are people who photograph anyone who comes in and out of events I attend. By tomorrow morning, your face is going to be attached to my name in certain conversations. He said this without inflection, the way a person states the temperature outside. Relevant information, not an apology. Voss was already on his phone when we left. That complicates your evening. She stared at him. You're telling me that leaving with you made things worse? I'm telling you that staying would have also made things worse, just differently. He picked up the unfinished glass of water from the counter, looked at it, set it back down. There's a guest room. Marcus will stay in the building. In the morning, we'll figure out the rest. I don't know you. No, he said. You don't. That's supposed to make me feel better about staying? I wasn't trying to make you feel better, Lucian said. I was giving you information. What you do with it is your business. She stood in the middle of his living room with her too thin dress and her shaking hands and the accumulated wreckage of an evening that had started as an attempt to prove she was fine. And she thought about her apartment, the 12-minute cab ride away, the lobby with the slow elevator, the floor she shared with 6 other units. The guest room, she said, down the hall, second door. She went. She did not say goodnight because it didn't seem like the kind of house where that was a required transaction. The guest room was clean and dark and smelled of nothing, which was its own kind of relief. She sat on the edge of the bed and took her shoes off and pressed her feet against the cold floor and breathed until her hands stopped shaking. Through the wall, she could hear Marcus's voice, low, continuous, the rhythm of someone moving through a list of things that needed handling. She could not hear Lucien's voice at all, and somehow that was more unsettling than if she could. She lay down without taking off the dress. She did not expect to sleep. She slept. In the morning, the apartment smelled like coffee. Alara woke to gray daylight through curtains she hadn't closed all the way, and for a disoriented moment, she was in her own bedroom, and everything was normal. Then the ceiling was wrong, and the weight of the mattress was wrong, and it all came back in one organized sequence: the gala, the corridor, the car, the name. She found the bathroom, splashed water on her face, looked at herself in the mirror for longer than was productive. Her mascara had migrated. Her hair had its own opinion. The dress looked like what it was. Last night's choices surviving into morning. The kitchen was empty when she came out, but there was a coffee maker with a note beside it that said, "Cups are above the machine" in handwriting that was precise and without flourish, and a paper bag from a bakery 2 blocks over that she had walked past 100 times without going in. She poured coffee and stood at the windows and looked at Chicago from the height that made it look organized. It wasn't organized, she knew that, but from up here you could almost believe the pattern was intentional. You slept. She turned. Lucian was in the doorway to what she assumed was his office. Same suit as last night, or one identical to it. No sign that the intervening hours had made any impression on him. A little, she said. He crossed to the coffee maker and poured his own cup, and stood on the other side of the counter from her, and for a moment they were just 2 people in a kitchen in the morning, and none of the rest of it existed. Marcus ran Caleb Voss last night, he said. There it was. And? He has debts. Lucian set his cup down. Not the kind you accrue from bad investments, the kind you accrue from borrowing from people who don't extend credit through normal institutions. She processed this. How much? Enough that his options are limited. He looked at her directly. He called you 3 times this morning before 7 a.m. Alara's stomach dropped. She had left her phone in her coat pocket. She had left her coat. My coat is in the lobby, at the hotel. Marcus has it. Of course Marcus had it. Caleb isn't just an ex-fiancé with unresolved feelings, Lucian said. He's a man in a very specific kind of trouble, looking for a very specific kind of leverage. I want you to understand that distinction before you decide what your next move is. What does that mean? It means don't answer his calls, Lucian said, until you know why he's making them. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and thought about the 11 minutes in the car and the feeling of Caleb's grip on her arm and the 3 calls before 7 a.m. and the way Lucian had said he has debts with the tone of someone who understood exactly what that meant in ways she didn't yet. "You're not telling me everything," she said. Lucian said, "No." She waited. "There's a conversation I need to finish before I can," he said. "Give me 2 hours." She had no reason to give him 2 hours. She had her phone back and her coat back, and she was capable of calling a cab. She was a grown woman with a job and an apartment and a life that was hers, and she had walked away from the last man who had managed her information and her movements and her access to the full picture of her own situation. She looked at Lucien Devereaux, at the precision of him, the absolute absence of performance, the way he had said no to her question without apology and without pretending it was something else. And she tried to locate the thing that made him feel different from Caleb. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't even kindness exactly. It was that he had told her he was withholding information instead of pretending he wasn't. That was a low bar. She knew it was a low bar. But 2 years out from Caleb Voss, a low bar cleared was still a bar cleared. 2 hours, she said. She stayed. Tick. The 2 hours turned into 4, and by noon Alara had found the spare phone charger in a kitchen drawer and retrieved 12 messages. 3 from Caleb, 2 from Naomi asking if she was alive, 1 from Greg, who had apparently not noticed she left, and 6 from a number she didn't recognize that had called and hung up without leaving a voicemail. She called Naomi back first. "Where are you?" Naomi said before hello. "I'm fine." "That's not where." "Where are you, Alara? Because Greg is useless and I have been... I'm uptown. I'm fine. I'll explain later." A pause. "The man. The one you left with." Another pause, with more weight in it. "Alara, I looked him up." Naomi. "I need you to tell me you know what you're doing." Alara looked at the Chicago skyline through the window and thought about what an honest answer to that would sound like. "I'll call you tonight," she said. She hung up before Naomi could push further. She did not return Caleb's calls. She stared at the unknown number until she felt the staring was getting her nowhere, then put the phone face down on the counter. Lucian reappeared from his office at 12:30. He looked the same as he had at 7 a.m. She wondered if he actually experienced time the way other people did, or if his relationship to it was fundamentally different, not hours passing, but decisions accumulating. "Voss has been in contact with a man named Rourke," Lucian said, without preamble, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table and sitting down across from her. "Darren Rourke. He runs distribution for the Halverson Group." The name meant nothing to her, but the tone it came in did. "That name is supposed to mean something to me," she said. "The Halverson Group is a competing interest in this city," Lucian said. "They have been for about 7 years. We have an arrangement, geography, product, who operates where. Rourke is their enforcement." She was quiet for a moment. "And Caleb has been talking to him?" "Since last night, yes." "About what?" Lucian put both hands flat on the table. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, and it was not comfortable. That was the word. Being in the full focus of Lucien Devereaux was not comfortable. It was like standing in a room where the thermostat had been turned up by someone who didn't notice heat. "About you," he said. The room did something. Not the room, her. Something in her chest compressed and then expanded, and she kept her face still by sheer force of the same practice she had spent 2 years building. "Me." "Voss is trying to pay a debt," Lucian said. "He told Rourke that he could provide information about my current associations." "I'm not your association. I'm an accountant you put in a car for 11 minutes. "Rourke doesn't know that." She stood up. Not because she had somewhere to go, she didn't, but because sitting still suddenly felt impossible. She moved to the window and put her back to the glass and looked at him across the room. "So Caleb sold information about me to dangerous people because he owes them money?" "Yes." "And you're telling me this because you need to know," Lucien said. Simply. Like it was obvious. Like the idea that a person might withhold relevant danger from someone it affected was foreign to him. Alara thought about that for a moment. About all the times Caleb had known things she should have known and had decided, for reasons that served him, that she didn't need to, about the way she had felt for 4 years. Like she was always 2 steps behind the actual story of her own life. "What does Rourke want?" she said. "Right now? To understand what you are to me." Lucien leaned back in the chair. "The faster he decides you're nothing, an accident, a woman I helped out of a corridor, the faster this simplifies. And if he decides I'm not nothing," Lucien said, "then it becomes a different kind of problem." She looked at him. He looked at her. The city sat outside the window, being enormous and indifferent. "So what do I do?" Alara said. "You go back to your life," he said. "Your apartment, your job, your routines. You don't take Caleb's calls, you don't engage. You let things settle. And if things don't settle..." He picked up his coffee cup. It had been empty for a while, but he looked at it anyway, the habit of a man who needed something to do with his hands occasionally and didn't have many options for that. "Then you call me," he said. "I don't have your number." He looked up. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, more like the ghost of the concept, the outline of what a smile would look like if he let one through. He set the cup down, pulled out a phone, and wrote a number on the paper bag from the bakery with a pen from his jacket pocket. He slid it across the table. She picked it up. The number was 7 digits written in the same precise handwriting as the note about the coffee cups. "That's it?" she said. "Just a number on a bag." "What did you want?" he said. "A contract?" She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. She took the bag and folded it and put it in the pocket of last night's dress and went to find her coat. She made it 4 days. 4 days of her own apartment, her own routines, the commute and the desk and the spreadsheets and the lunch she ate at the same table near the window because the light was better there. 4 days of not answering Caleb's calls, which had tapered from 3 a day to 1 and then to silence, which she did not trust but accepted. 4 days of the paper bag from the bakery sitting on her nightstand because she had transferred the number to her phone on the first night but hadn't thrown the bag away. On the 5th day, she was walking home from the office. It was raining, the thin, cold, mean kind of rain that Chicago did in November, the kind that didn't fall so much as it accumulated, finding its way past every layer until there was no part of you that was entirely dry. She had an umbrella. It was mostly theoretical. She was half a block from her building when she heard her name. Not Caleb's voice. Different, rougher, with an accent she couldn't immediately place, something flat and hard-edged. She turned. 2 men, both large in the deliberate way of people who maintain size professionally. One of them had his hands in his jacket pockets. The other was holding an umbrella he wasn't using. "Miss Whitmore," the one with the unused umbrella said, "Darren Rourke would like 5 minutes of your time." Her phone was in her coat pocket. The paper bag number was in her phone. The distance from where she was standing to her building door was 40 feet, and the rain was coming sideways now, and there were 2 large men between her and the street. "I don't know who that is," she said. The words came out even. She was proud of that. "He thought you might say that," the man said. "He asked me to tell you that Caleb Voss sends his regards." The rain hit the pavement around them with a sound like something tearing, and Alara stood on the sidewalk with her mostly theoretical umbrella and understood with complete and sudden clarity that the 4 days of ordinary life had been an interval, not a resolution, and that whatever came next was not going to look anything like the life she had spent 2 years carefully rebuilding. She did not run. That was the thing she would remember afterward. Not what they said, not the rain, not the particular quality of fear that had moved through her when the man said Caleb's name. What she would remember was that she did not run. She stood on the wet sidewalk with her umbrella doing nothing useful, and she looked at the 2 men and she breathed and she did not run. 5 minutes, she said. The man with the unused umbrella nodded once, like this was the answer he had expected, like her decision had already been made before she made it, and he had simply been waiting for her to catch up. He gestured toward a black car idling at the curb. Not a threatening gesture, almost courteous, the kind of gesture a doorman makes when he's holding something open for you. She got in. The drive was shorter than the one with Lucian had been. 8 minutes, maybe 9. They stopped in front of a restaurant on West Randolph that was closed for the evening. Dark windows, chairs up on tables visible through the glass, but the door opened from inside when the man with the umbrella knocked twice. Inside smelled like old cooking oil and something floral from a cleaning product. The overhead lights were off. There was a single lamp on a table in the back corner, and at that table sat a man who was not physically remarkable in any way that prepared you for the effect of being in the same room as him. Darren Rourke was perhaps 55, medium height, with thinning hair the color of wet sand and a face that had been lived in hard and had developed from that living the particular texture of old leather, not unpleasant, just worn in ways that communicated durability rather than comfort. He was drinking coffee from a paper cup, and he did not stand when she came in, which told her something about how he understood the balance of this meeting. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Sit down." She sat across from him. The table between them was small enough that she could have reached across it without fully extending her arm, which was either a calculated intimacy or simply the furniture that was available. She didn't know which. She kept her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she looked at him directly because looking away from men like this was a thing she was done doing. "Coffee?" he said. "No." He nodded, like she had confirmed something. He took a slow sip from his own cup and set it down and looked at her with eyes that were a pale, undramatic gray, and had in them the quality of a person who processes information faster than they react to it. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I don't know what you expected." "Someone's scared," he said. "People are usually scared when my guys pick them up off the street." "I am scared," Ilara said. "I'm just not going to perform it for you." Something moved in his face. Not warmth. Something more like recalibration. He picked up his coffee cup again and turned it in his hands without drinking from it. "Caleb Voss told me you were nobody," he said. "An accountant. A woman Devereaux felt sorry for in a hotel corridor." "That's accurate." "Is it?" "Yes." "Then why?" Rourke said, setting the cup down with a precision that was its own kind of emphasis. "Did he have you in his apartment the following morning?" The question sat between them, and Ilara felt the specific weight of it. The way it was constructed not to get information but to see what she did with it, to watch her decide whether to lie and how, to measure the gap between her prepared answer and her instinctive one. "He was being cautious," she said. "He didn't know what Caleb would do." "Devereaux doesn't bring women to his apartment out of caution," Rourke said. "He's been doing this for 15 years, and I have never once heard of him bringing a woman to that apartment. Not one time." He leaned forward just slightly, just enough to change the geometry of the table between them. "So I'll ask you again. Who are you to him?" "Nobody," Ilara said. "I am exactly what Caleb told you I am." Rourke looked at her for a long moment. The rain outside had found the window seams and was making a thin, insistent sound against the glass. Somewhere in the back of the restaurant, a pipe knocked twice and went quiet. "Caleb Voss owes my organization $400,000, Rourke said. "He came to me 3 weeks ago with a proposal. Said he could give me something worth more than the debt." He paused. "You know what he offered?" She did not know, but she was beginning to understand the shape of it, and the shape of it made something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the rain still in her hair. "He offered to give me Devereaux," Rourke said. "Not directly, not a location, not a schedule, something more useful. He said he could give me the one person Devereaux would move for, the one person who could bring him out from behind his walls into open ground." He looked at her. "He said that person was you." The lamp in the corner threw a yellow circle on the table between them, and outside of it, the restaurant was all shadow, and the sound of rain and Ilara sat in the middle of it and let the sentence finish landing. Caleb had sold her, not as an afterthought, not as a desperate improvisation on the night of the gala. He had gone to Rourke 3 weeks before the gala and offered her his currency, had planned it, had constructed it, had perhaps even arranged to be at the same event precisely because he needed her visible and connected to Lucian for the story to work. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs under the table because she needed something solid to press against. "He's wrong," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of it for the second time in an hour. "I'm not that person. Whatever he told you about me and Devereaux, he invented it or he inflated it. There is no... I'm not the person you move him with." Rourke watched her say all of this. He did not look convinced, and he did not look unconvinced. He looked like a man completing a calculation that required more variables than were currently available. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not." He picked up his coffee and finished it and crushed the paper cup in one hand with the casual ease of someone for whom small destructions are habitual. "Here's what I know. Voss believes it enough to stake his life on it. And I've been watching Devereaux for 7 years. I've never seen him make a personal decision. Never. Not one time in 7 years has that man done something that wasn't strategic." He dropped the crushed cup on the table. "Sit. He put you in his car and took you to his apartment in front of 3 of my people's cameras. That's not strategic. That's something else." Alara said nothing. "So I'm going to do something I don't generally do," Rourke said. "I'm going to give you a choice." He folded his hands on the table. "You walk out of here tonight and you go back to your life and I forget this conversation happened. And in exchange, the next time Devereaux wants to see you, you tell me first. That's all. Just a phone call. Where? When?" The restaurant was very quiet. "You're asking me to set him up," Alara said. "I'm asking you to make a phone call." "Those are the same thing," Rourke shrugged, a small movement that communicated neither agreement nor disagreement. "The other option," he said, "is that Voss was right about what you mean to Devereaux, in which case you become significantly more useful to me as a guest than as a free agent, and this conversation has a different kind of ending." She looked at him across the small table in the yellow light of the single lamp, and she thought, he's not bluffing. She had spent 4 years learning the specific texture of a bluff from a man who deployed them constantly, and Rourke was not bluffing. He was a man explaining terms. The terms were real. "I need to think," she said. "Of course." He said it like a man who had already decided how the thinking would end. "Sal will drive you home." She stood. Her legs were steady, which surprised her. The man named Sal appeared from somewhere in the dark back of the restaurant with the particular timing of someone who had been waiting for a cue. At the door, Rourke's voice came across the room. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. "Don't take too long," he said. "Voss is very motivated, and motivated men make impatient partners." She was in her apartment by 9:30. She did not turn on all the lights. She turned on the lamp in the living room and sat on the floor with her back against the couch. Not the couch, the floor, because the floor was lower and harder and more honest. And she took out her phone. She had the number. She had put it in her phone on the first night and labeled it with nothing, no name, just the number, because giving it a name felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make. She stared at it for 6 minutes. She knew it was 6 minutes because she was an accountant, and she counted things when she had no other way to hold herself together. Then she called. It rang twice. "Whitmore." His voice was the same as it had been in the car, in the kitchen, at the table. Like he had been expecting the call in a general sense, not tonight specifically, but eventually, and tonight was as good as any other time. "Rourke picked me up outside my building," she said, 20 minutes ago. He had 2 men. We went to a restaurant on West Randolph. A silence, not a long one. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Are you home?" "Yes." "Stay there." The line went dead. She sat on the floor and looked at the middle distance and tried to organize what she knew into an order that made sense. Caleb had gone to Rourke 3 weeks before the gala, had planned this, had presented her body, her history, her connection to a man she had met by accident in a hotel corridor, as a debt payment, had calculated that the kiss in the hallway, or whatever version of it had reached Rourke's people through whatever channels those things traveled, meant she had value she had never consented to having. She pressed the back of her head against the couch cushion and closed her eyes. 4 years. 4 years she had spent believing on some level that whatever had happened between her and Caleb was a private catastrophe, a personal failure, something that existed between 2 people and had its damage contained within that space. She had worked so hard to make it small enough to step over, to reduce it to a chapter, a bad relationship, A thing that was over. It was not over. It had never been contained. Caleb had been building something with her as the material, and she had been the last to know, which was the most Caleb thing he had ever done to her. She heard Lucian's voice again. He has debts, not the kind you accrue from bad investments. He had known, not the specifics maybe, but the shape of it. He had told her to go back to her life. She had gone back to her life. And the life she had gone back to had already been compromised before she returned to it. Lucian arrived at 43 minutes past 10 with Marcus and a man she hadn't seen before, who had the particular quality of someone whose profession was adjacent to violence without being violence itself. A lawyer, maybe, or something that required the same skill set. He didn't knock. He called from the lobby and she buzzed him up, and when she opened the door, he came in and looked at her with one quick, comprehensive look that cataloged her condition: unhurt, shaken, controlled. And then he moved past her into the apartment, and Marcus came in behind him, and the third man stayed in the hallway. "Walk me through it," Lucian said. He was standing in her living room, looking at her space with the expression of a man doing math in his head, and she realized he was noting the exits, the windows, the sight lines from the door. She walked him through it, all of it. Rourke's face, his hands on the table, the crushed paper cup, the specific language of the offer he had made her, the specific language of the alternative. She said it plainly and in order and without editorializing, because this was not a moment for anything except accuracy. When she finished, Lucian was quiet for a moment. "He gave you a choice," he said. "Yes." "You called me instead of taking it." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with something that was harder to read than his usual expressions. "Why?" She thought about it honestly, because he was asking honestly, and she owed him that much. "Because the choice he gave me wasn't a choice," she said. "It was just a different version of being used. I've spent a long time choosing between versions of being used by other people." She held his gaze. "I'm done with that." Lucian turned to Marcus. "Get Voss." Marcus had his phone out before the sentence was finished. "What are you going to do?" Elara said. "I'm going to have a conversation," Lucian said. "With Caleb." "Yes." "Lucian." She waited until he looked at her. "What kind of conversation?" He looked at her for a moment, and in that moment she understood. Not the specifics, but the general territory, the country that conversation lived in, and she felt the weight of what it meant to be standing in her own living room asking this question. "The kind that ends things," he said. They brought Caleb in at midnight, not to her apartment, to a building on the south side that Elara had not been to before and would not be able to find again on a map. A low industrial space that smelled of concrete and old machinery and the particular cold that accumulates in rooms that are not regularly heated. She had not been asked if she wanted to come. She had simply gotten into the car when it left. Caleb was already there when they arrived. He was sitting in a chair in the center of the space under a work light that someone had positioned to illuminate him specifically, and when Elara walked in behind Lucian, she saw, in the fraction of a second before Caleb registered her presence, what he looked like when he was genuinely afraid. She had seen him angry. She had seen him cold. She had seen him in the particular mode he entered when he was about to say something that would take her 3 days to recover from. She had never seen him afraid. It lasted a fraction of a second. Then he saw her, and the fear was replaced by something she also recognized. The reflex of a man reaching for control the only way he knew how, which was to make everything that was happening someone else's fault. "Elara," he said. His voice was even, almost. "I can explain this." She said nothing. She stood at the edge of the light with her arms at her sides, and she looked at him. Lucian walked to within 6 feet of the chair and stopped. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his body was entirely relaxed, which Elara was beginning to understand was the most dangerous version of him. 3 weeks before the gala, Lucian said. "Walk me through it." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you've been told." "I know what I've been told," Lucian said. "I'm asking you to walk me through it." A pause. Caleb was doing the calculation. What they knew, what they could prove, what story fit the available space. She had watched him do this calculation in smaller rooms for smaller stakes, and she knew what it looked like, and she knew that what came out the other side of it was rarely honest. "I had a debt," Caleb said. Rourke was pressing me. I needed to give him something. You gave him her, Lucian said. I gave him information. I told him she knew you. That's all. Just that she knew you. 3 weeks before you arranged to be at the same gala. Caleb's mouth tightened. I didn't arrange anything. The Hartley firm was on the guest list, Lucian said. You made a call to the organizer 2 weeks prior and confirmed their attendance would include senior staff. He said this without heat, without drama, just as a sequence of facts in the order they occurred. You put her in a room with me. You needed her visible, connected. Rourke needed a reason to believe the story. The silence in the room had the quality of something under pressure. Caleb looked at Ilara, not at Lucian, at her. And in his face was the expression she knew better than almost any other. The appeal to a shared history, the reach toward the private language of two people who had spent years together, the implicit argument that whatever else was true, she knew him, she had known him, and that knowing obligated her to something. Ilara, he said. Don't, she said. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I needed the debt cleared. I thought Rourke would make contact. It would come to nothing. The whole thing would... You put me in front of a man who runs enforcement for a crime organization, Ilara said. You planned it 3 weeks ago. Her voice was steady. It was the steadiest it had been all night. You looked at me, at my life, at everything you already took from me, and you decided I could be useful one more time. Caleb said nothing. That's who you are, she said, not who you became, who you've always been. The words landed in the concrete room and settled there. And Caleb Voss sat in the chair under the work light with nothing left to reach for. And Ilara looked at the man who had spent 4 years making her feel like the problem, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment, in this room, at this hour. Not triumph, not relief, clarity. The kind that arrives not when you finally win, but when you finally stop needing to. Lucian turned from Caleb and looked at her, and what she saw in his face in that moment was something she didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't admiration, it was something more serious than that. The look of a man who has just seen someone do a difficult thing cleanly and has updated his understanding of them accordingly. Then Marcus's phone rang. The sound was jarring in the quiet room. Marcus answered, listened for 4 seconds, and said 2 words to Lucian that turned everything that had just happened into a prelude. They moved, Marcus said. Lucian went very still. Rourke didn't wait, Marcus said. He's not at Randolph. He's at the Devereaux building. He has 6 men, and he has the woman from your security desk, and he is asking, very specifically, for you to come explain why you didn't take his offer more seriously, and he is asking for you to bring Ilara Whitmore with you, and he says that if you are not there in 30 minutes, he is going to demonstrate to everyone in this city what happens to people who think Halverson patience is unlimited. The concrete room was very quiet. Caleb was looking at the floor. Lucian was looking at Ilara. And Ilara was looking at Lucian and understanding, with a completeness that left no room for any remaining version of the life she had tried to rebuild, that the next 30 minutes were going to determine everything. Not just what happened tonight, not just what happened to the woman from the security desk, not just what happened to Caleb or Rourke or the careful arrangements of power in this city, but what happened to her, to who she was, to the person she had spent 2 years trying to become in the ruins of who Caleb had made her believe she was. She looked at Lucian and she said, "Tell me what you need." Lucian said, "Stay close to Marcus." That was all. No speech, no reassurance, no version of everything is going to be fine, because he was not a man who said things he couldn't guarantee. He turned from her and was already on his phone, already moving, already thinking 3 steps into a problem she was still catching up to. And Ilara understood that this was what he looked like when the ordinary version of his life resumed. Not the man in the kitchen with the coffee cup, not the man who wrote a phone number on a bakery bag, but the one underneath all of that, the one the city had spent 15 years being afraid of. She stayed close to Marcus. They left Caleb in the room with 2 men she didn't know, which told her something about where Caleb ranked in the current order of priorities. He called her name once as they moved toward the door. She didn't turn around, not because she was being cold, or not only because of that, but because there was genuinely nothing left in that direction worth turning for. The drive to the Devereaux building took 9 minutes. Lucian spent 7 of them on the phone, speaking in short, precise sentences that she caught fragments of. Names, numbers, addresses, instructions that arrived fully formed without preamble or explanation. Marcus spent the same 9 minutes on a separate call, doing something similar in a lower register. Alara sat between them in the back seat and kept her breathing even and counted the lights they passed through. 14 green, 3 red, one that was out entirely. The Devereaux building on North Wabash was 12 stories of glass and steel that looked from the outside like nothing more threatening than an upscale mixed-use property. Retail on the ground floor, offices above, residences at the top. She knew from the ride with Lucian that the penthouse occupied the entire 12th floor. She knew from the last 3 weeks of her life that the building was considerably more defended than its exterior suggested. What she did not know, until the car stopped half a block south and Marcus leaned forward to show Lucian something on his phone, was that Rourke had positioned men at 3 of the 4 street-level entrances and had 2 more on the roof of the parking structure across the street. "He came prepared," Marcus said. "He's been prepared since Tuesday," Lucian said. "This isn't improvised." Alara looked at the building. A light was on in the lobby that shouldn't have been. She could see it from here. A single bright rectangle in the otherwise dim ground floor. "The woman from the security desk," she said. "Is she alone in there?" "Her name is Priya," Lucian said, without looking away from the building. "She's been on my desk for 3 years." "Is she alone?" "Rourke has 2 men with her." Alara did the arithmetic she could see. 6 men on the street, 2 on the roof across the way, 2 inside with Priya. 10 people who were there because of a chain of events that had started with a debt Caleb owed, and a calculation he had made about the value of her connection to the man sitting next to her. "He wants you in the open," she said. "That's what the building is about. He knows you won't send people in while Priya is in there." Lucian turned and looked at her with an expression that was, in a very constrained way, impressed. "He's right," Lucian said. "So don't go in," she said. "Give him something else to look at." A beat. Marcus was very still. "He asked for me," Lucian said, specifically. "He asked for you and for me," Alara said, specifically. The sentence sat between them, and she watched Lucian follow it to the same place she had already arrived. "No," he said. "You said tell you what you need." "I didn't mean. You have 10 men positioned around a building, and 2 of them are with someone who works for you and has nothing to do with any of this," Alara said. "Rourke thinks I'm the variable. He thinks I'm the thing that moves you, so let me move independently." She kept her voice level. She kept her hands still in her lap. "I walk in the front. His men on the street see me come in alone. It pulls his attention to the lobby. It gives you whatever window you need. If something goes wrong, I've been in a room with Rourke," she said. "He's transactional. He won't touch me until he has what he wants, and what he wants is you in the open." She looked at him directly. "So don't be in the open." The car was very quiet. Marcus said to no one in particular, "She's not wrong." Lucian looked at Alara for a long moment. She held the look and did not fill the silence with anything, because she was done filling silences to make powerful men more comfortable. "Front entrance," he said finally. "You walk in. You tell them you're there to negotiate on my behalf. That's all. You do not go above the lobby. You do not—" "I know," she said. She got out of the car before he could say anything else, because if she sat there another 30 seconds, she was going to think about it long enough to stop. The front entrance of the Devereaux building had a set of revolving doors and a small awning and a camera above the door that she could see the red light of from 6 feet away. She pushed through the revolving door, and the lobby air hit her, warm and artificially clean, and she counted 3 seconds before the man near the security desk moved toward her. He was large, wearing a dark jacket, his right hand staying near his side in a way that was not accidental. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I'm here to talk to Rourke," she said. "Tell him I'm here instead of Devereaux. Tell him I can deliver what he wants." The man looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out a phone and turned away and spoke quietly into it. Alara stood in the lobby and looked past him at the security desk, where a woman in her 30s was sitting in a chair with her wrists zip-tied to the armrests and a bruise beginning to develop along her left cheekbone, and her eyes tracking Alara with an expression that had in it both fear and something fiercer than fear. "Priya." 3 years on Lucian's security desk. The bruise on her cheek told Alara that the men with her had communicated Rourke's seriousness through means they considered persuasive. The man with the phone turned back. "Elevator," he said. "I said I'm not going above the lobby." "Mr. Rourke is not in the lobby." Alara looked at Priya. Priya looked back at her. Something passed between them that had no words. The specific communication of two women in a room full of men who had decided to treat them as objects of transaction, recognizing each other across that shared condition. "Which floor?" Alara said. 8. She walked to the elevator. The man followed her, close but not touching, and inside the elevator he stood at her back, and she looked at the floor counter above the doors and breathed and did not think about anything except the next 30 seconds, and the 30 seconds after that, because thinking further than that was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. The 8th floor was open plan, a partially finished office space, walls framed but not drywalled, concrete floors, the exposed bones of a building still becoming itself. Work lights on stands threw hard shadows across the space. There were 4 men she could see immediately, positioned at the corners with a competence that said these were not Rourke's first or second-tier men. These were people who knew what they were doing and had done it before. Rourke was standing at the window. He didn't turn when she came in. He stood looking down at the street 8 floors below with his hands clasped behind his back, and she noticed that his jacket was different from the restaurant, heavier, darker, the jacket of a man who had expected to be outside tonight and had dressed for it. "You came without him," Rourke said. "Yes." He turned. Whatever he had expected, she could see in the very slight change in his expression that she was not quite it. "Brave," he said. "Or stupid." "You told me not to take too long," Alara said. "I didn't take too long." He studied her. "Where is he?" "Close." "That's not an answer." "He sent me to negotiate," she said, "so negotiate with me." Rourke walked away from the window, and the distance between them decreased, and she held her ground because moving backward was not something she was prepared to do in this room. He stopped about 5 feet from her and looked at her with those pale gray eyes that moved fast and revealed little. "What is there to negotiate?" he said. "I have his building. I have his woman on the security desk. I have 8 men in position outside and 2 more on the roof across the street. What does he have to offer me that changes any of that?" "He has the ability to make the next 5 years of your operation in this city either functional or impossible," Alara said. "And you know that, or you wouldn't be here asking for a meeting. You'd have burned the building and sent a message." Rourke was quiet. "You want to renegotiate the territory arrangement," she said. "That's what this is. Caleb gave you a reason to force the conversation, but the conversation is what you actually wanted. So let's have it." The work lights threw everything into hard contrast, and in that hard light, Darren Rourke looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in his face the specific calculation of a man deciding whether to be annoyed by her accuracy or respect it. Then the window behind him blew inward, not explosively, not a bomb, not a breach. A single controlled entry, the frame giving way with a sound like a heavy exhalation, and 3 men came through it on lines from the floor above with a speed and coordination that said they had practiced this specific movement and had practiced it until it was muscle memory. Simultaneously, the stairwell door at the far end of the floor burst open, and 3 more came through that, and the 4 men Rourke had positioned at the corners turned, and what followed was not the prolonged cinematic version of a fight. It was fast and brutal and over in fragments, the sound of it wrong and percussive in the unfinished space. Alara dropped. Not a conscious decision. Her knees hit the concrete before she had processed the command to move, and she pressed herself against the nearest framed wall and made herself small and kept her head down and listened to the room resolve itself around her. It resolved in less than 40 seconds. When she looked up, 4 of Rourke's men were on the floor, and the remaining 4, including the man who had ridden up with her in the elevator, were backed against the wall with their hands visible. Lucien's people held the room with the particular stillness of people who have stopped exerting themselves. Lucien came through the stairwell door. He had a cut above his left eye that was bleeding freely, darkening the collar of his shirt, and he was walking with a slight unevenness on his right side that said something had happened to that leg between the car and here, and he walked through his own people and past Rourke's disarmed men and across the unfinished concrete floor with none of that slowing him in any visible way that mattered. He stopped in front of Rourke. Rourke had not run. That was the thing. In the 40 seconds of chaos with the window coming in and his men going down, Rourke had not moved from the spot where he'd been standing. He stood now with his hands at his sides and his expression set in the particular arrangement of a man who has made his bet and is watching the table to see how it lands. "The woman downstairs," Lucian said. His voice was even. The blood from his eye had reached his jaw. "If she's hurt beyond what I can already see, this conversation has a different kind of ending." "She's fine," Rourke said. "I know she's fine. Marcus called it in 2 minutes ago." Lucian looked at him. "I'm telling you what the alternative would have been." A silence. "The arrangement," Lucian said. "You want to renegotiate." Rourke's eyes moved briefly to Alara, who was on her feet now, standing at the edge of the space with concrete dust on her knees and her heartbeat in her teeth. Something moved in Rourke's expression that was as close to acknowledgement as she suspected he got. "Your accountant figured that out," Rourke said. "Yes," Lucian said, without looking at her. "She does that. She's good at it." "Yes." Rourke looked back at Lucian. "You were going to have this conversation with me eventually," he said. "Caleb made it sooner." "Caleb made it messier," Lucian said. "There's a difference." "Are you prepared to have it now?" Lucian looked at him for a moment. The blood was still moving down his jaw. He reached up without particular drama and pressed his sleeve against the cut above his eye, held it for a few seconds, took it away. The bleeding had slowed, but not stopped. "Sit down," Lucian said. There was no table, no chairs. Rourke looked around the unfinished floor with its work lights and its framed walls, and for one surreal moment Alara thought he was going to point out the inadequacy of the venue. And then he sat down on the concrete floor. Lucian sat across from him. Two men who controlled between them the better part of Chicago's shadow economy, sitting on a concrete floor in an unfinished office space with blood on the carpet that hadn't been laid yet, and Alara standing at the edge of it, watching something ancient and inevitable working itself out. "The West Corridor," Lucian said. "You want expansion." "I want the distribution rights from Halstead to the lake," Rourke said. "I've wanted them for 3 years and you know it." "In exchange for what?" "Halverson pulls back from the River North properties. Permanently. You've had 3 incursions in 18 months. You stop the 4th before it starts." Lucian was quiet for a moment. He pressed his sleeve to his eye again. The cut was deep enough that it was going to need something other than pressure, but that was a problem for later, and both of them knew it. "The Halstead corridor runs through 2 of my existing accounts," Lucian said. "I know." "I'd need written assurance. I don't do written." "Then this is a short conversation." Rourke looked at him. Something shifted in the negotiation, Hob. She could feel it, the subtle movement of a position adjusting, the way a person moves their weight before they change direction. "What kind of assurance?" Rourke said. Lucian looked at Alara. She understood, from the look and from everything that had preceded the look, that this was a question being directed at her in the form of a glance, that he was asking her to see something, to think about it, to bring whatever it was she did with numbers and patterns and the structural logic of agreements to a conversation he was having with a man on a concrete floor at 11:30 at night. She walked forward. She crossed the unfinished floor in a ruined dress with the concrete dust on her knees, and she stood at the edge of the space between them, and she said, "A witness." Both men looked at her. "Not written," she said. "A witness. Someone neither of you controls who can confirm the terms of the arrangement and is invested in both sides holding to them." She paused. "Someone with professional standing who can document an agreement that looks from the outside like a legitimate business arrangement." A silence. "You're talking about yourself," Rourke said. "I'm talking about a professional structure," she said. "A legitimate business entity that holds the terms of the agreement and has legal standing to—" "You're talking about yourself," Rourke said again, with something in his voice that was not hostile. She was. She hadn't entirely known that until he said it back to her, but she was. She was talking about becoming the fulcrum of an arrangement between 2 men who had been circling each other for 7 years and had just, on a concrete floor in a half-finished building, arrived at the moment when circling had to stop. She was an accountant. She understood the structure of agreements. She understood the paper trails that made power relationships legible to the world that wasn't supposed to see them. She understood, in the particular way that people understand things that have been built into them by years of close observation, exactly what a legitimate business structure layered over an illegitimate arrangement looked like and how to make it hold. She looked at Lucian. He was looking at her with the cut still bleeding freely above his eye and his shirt ruined and his weight still uneven on his right leg, and what was in his face was the most complete version of attention she had ever received from another person. Not possession, not calculation, not the performance of concern that Caleb had deployed to manage her, just absolute unmediated presence, the look of a man who has seen someone become something and is not going to look away from it. "Elara," he said, low, just her name. "I know what I'm saying," she said. "Once you're in this, I know," she said. "There's no—" "Lucian." She held his gaze. "I know." The room was very quiet. Rourke was looking between them with the expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the dynamics of this situation. The men at the walls were still. The city outside the broken window continued its organized indifference. Lucian looked at her for one more long moment, and then he looked at Rourke, and he said, "Do we have a conversation to finish?" Rourke looked at Elara. Then he looked at Lucian. "The Halstead corridor," Rourke said, "and the River North properties, and the woman who just walked onto a concrete floor and told two men how to stop a war." He paused. "We have a conversation to finish." The work lights hummed. The blood on Lucian's jaw had reached his collar. Elara stood at the center of a room full of men and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, that the ground under her feet was ground she had chosen and not ground that had been chosen for her. And it was harder and colder and more dangerous than anything she had stood on before, and she was not moving from it. The negotiation took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Elara knew because she counted, the way she always counted when her body needed something to hold on to, while her mind did the harder work. 2 hours and 14 minutes on a concrete floor in an unfinished office space with work lights throwing hard shadows, and the broken window letting in November air that smelled of exhaust and rain, and the particular cold that the lake pushed into the city when it had nothing better to do. She sat on the floor with her back against a framed wall and a legal pad that one of Lucian's men had produced from somewhere. She didn't ask where, the same way she didn't ask about several things that happened in that room. And she wrote. Not a contract. Nothing that would hold up in any court that operated under normal rules. A structure. The bones of an arrangement that could be dressed in legitimate language, that could be made to look, from the outside, like the kind of business relationship that accountants documented and attorneys reviewed and nobody looked at twice. She had done this before, in the abstract. Every major firm in Chicago had clients whose arrangements required a certain kind of creative architecture, a certain willingness to build structures that were technically sound and strategically opaque. She had always been good at it. She had always understood, at the level where professional skill lives, that the difference between a legal arrangement and an illegal one was often less about the substance than about the scaffolding around it. She built the scaffolding. Rourke watched her write with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between skepticism and the reluctant attention of a man watching someone do something well. Lucian watched her with no expression at all, which by now she understood was the version of him that was most completely present. When she finished, she read it back to both of them, not performing it, just reading it, plainly, the way she read quarterly reports. Here are the numbers. Here is what they mean. Here is what has to be true for them to hold. When she finished, there was a silence. That's clean, Rourke said. It needs a holding entity, she said, a legitimate LLC registered in Illinois with a stated purpose in property management or consulting, something dull enough that nobody looks at it. Can you build that? Yes. Rourke looked at Lucian. She's useful. I know, Lucian said. I mean specifically, not decoratively. Rourke looked back at Elara. I mean, she should be in a room the next time there's a structural conversation. Elara said nothing. She folded the legal pad pages in half and held them because there was nothing else to do with them. Rourke stood, which took him slightly longer than it would have taken a younger man, and he pressed his hands against his knees on the way up, the way people do when joints have accumulated history. He looked at Lucian, who was still on the floor with his back against the opposite wall, and his eyes still bleeding, slower now, the cut dark and crusted at the edges. "The Halverson incursions stop by the end of the month," Rourke said. "The Halstead corridor is yours from the first," Lucian said, "but not the secondary accounts. Those stay mine until the entity is registered and the terms are documented." 2 weeks. 10 days. A pause. 10 days, Rourke said. He left. His men left with him, collecting the ones who could walk and doing something with the ones who couldn't, that Alara did not watch closely. The room emptied with a speed that felt almost domestic, the clearing away of things after a gathering that had run long. When the last of them were gone, the floor was quiet, except for the wind through the broken window and the distant sound of the city, and Lucian still sitting on the concrete with his back against the wall and his eyes closed. Alara crossed the floor and sat down next to him, not across from him. Next to him, with her back against the same wall, their shoulders 18 inches apart, both of them looking at the empty space where a room full of dangerous men had been, and was now just unfinished construction. "Your eye needs stitches," she said. "Yes," he said. He didn't open his eyes. "And your leg?" "My leg is fine." "You've been favoring your right side for 2 hours." A pause. "It's manageable." "That's not the same as fine." He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling, which was exposed ductwork and conduit, and the bones of a building still becoming itself. "You shouldn't have come up here," he said. "You needed the window." "There were other ways to create a window." "Name one that worked as fast." He was quiet. "I'm not interested in having an argument about whether I should have done it," Alara said. "I did it. It worked. What I'm interested in is what happens next." Lucian turned his head and looked at her. The cut above his eye was going to leave a scar. She could see that already, the depth of it, the way the skin had separated. And she had the strange, specific thought that in 6 months she would be able to look at his face and see the mark of this night in it, and that there was something honest about a body that kept its records that way. "The entity," he said. "You know what you're building." "I know what I'm building. Once it exists, once your name is on the registration." "I know," she said. "Alara." "Lucian." She held his gaze. "I built the structure tonight because I understand it. Not because someone told me to, not because I was afraid, because I looked at the room and I saw what it needed and I could provide it." She paused. "That's different from being used. I need you to understand that distinction." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind came through the broken window and moved the dust on the concrete floor in slow patterns that meant nothing and looked like something. "I understand it," he said. "Good," she said. They sat on the floor together in the gutted room while the city continued outside, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was itself a kind of information. Marcus drove them to a Dr. Lucian used, not a hospital, a private practice on the Gold Coast with a waiting room that stayed empty after hours, and a physician who had the particular quality of someone who had learned not to ask about the origin of injuries. The cut above Lucian's eye took 11 stitches. His right knee had a deep contusion from something that had happened in the stairwell, something he described to the doctor in 2 words, and then stopped describing. Alara sat in the waiting room while they worked on him and held the folded legal pad pages in her lap and stared at the wall. She was building an entity. She was putting her name, her professional license, her standing in the city, the 2 years she had spent reconstructing a life from rubble, onto a structure that would make her, formally and permanently, part of the world she had walked into through a service exit in a hotel on a night she had chosen a thin dress and decided to prove something to herself. She thought about whether she was afraid. She was, a little. The specific fear of someone who has made a decision that cannot be undone and knows it. But it was different from the fear she had carried for 4 years inside Caleb's orbit. That fear had been diffuse and unlocatable, had lived in her chest like weather, had made her doubt the evidence of her own perception. This was sharp and specific, and had a shape she could hold in her hands. She could look directly at it. That was different. Lucian came out with a white bandage over his left eye and a different quality to his walk. Still uneven, the knee was going to be slow. And he looked at her sitting in the waiting room with the folded pages in her lap, and he said, "Hungry?" She laughed. Not a big laugh. The kind that comes out when the alternative is crying, and you choose the other option. "Yes," she said. "Actually, yes." They found a diner 4 blocks away that was open at 2 in the morning because some diners just are, and they sat in a corner booth under fluorescent lights that were merciless about everything. And Alara ate scrambled eggs and toast, and Lucian ate nothing but drank 3 cups of coffee, and they sat across from each other in a diner booth at 2 in the morning and talked. Really talked. Not strategically. Not with an agenda. The way people talk when something difficult has just finished and the body doesn't know how to stop being in it yet, and talking is the only way to begin the transition. She told him about the firm, about the work she was actually good at, and the work she found herself doing because she was good at it, and there was no one else. About the lunch table by the window and the light, and the 9-figure accounts that she managed with a precision that nobody at Hartley & Associates had adequately acknowledged. About the way numbers felt to her. Not cold, not abstract, but structural. The skeleton of things. The part that held the visible world up. He listened. Actually listened, with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Complete and unperformed and slightly uncomfortable to be the recipient of, because it left you nowhere to hide. He told her things in return. Not everything. She understood that there were territories she was not going to access tonight, or possibly ever, and she found she didn't resent that the way she might have expected to. He told her about the city as he understood it, not the version that appeared in newspapers or political speeches, but the actual city, the one that ran on relationships that didn't get written down, and agreements that were kept because breaking them was more expensive than honoring them. He told her that what she had built on the legal pad tonight was better than anything his own people had put together in 3 years of trying to create the same structure. Why couldn't they do it? She said. They were too close to it, he said. They understood the substance and tried to build from the inside out. You understood the structure and built from the outside in. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. You started from what it had to look like to someone who didn't know what it was. That's an accounting problem, she said. Every audit is an accounting problem. How does this look to someone who has no context and a mandate to find something wrong? Yes, he said. That's not a special skill, she said. That's just the job. Most people don't do their job that well, Lucian said. She looked at him across the diner table in the fluorescent light and thought about all the versions of the last 5 weeks that could have gone differently. The thin dress, the Drake Hotel, the service corridor, the car, the bakery bag, the 11 minutes, the 4 days, the rain, the restaurant on West Randolph, the choice that wasn't a choice, the concrete floor, the broken window, and she thought that there was no version of any of it that she had controlled, no moment where she had been the one setting the terms of what happened to her, until tonight. Until she had walked to the center of that room and said, "A witness." "Caleb," she said. Lucian put the coffee cup down. "What happens to him?" she said. Not a demand. A real question. Lucian looked at her with an expression that was careful in a way that told her he had been waiting for this question and had decided in advance to answer it honestly. "He's in a room," he said. "He'll stay there until this settles. And then, he owes Rourke $400,000. That debt is now mine." A pause. "Which means Caleb owes me." She looked at him. "That's not the same as him being free." "No," Lucian said. "Is he safe?" Lucian was quiet for a moment. "He's not in danger," he said finally. "He made a decision that put the people around him in danger. He's going to spend some time understanding that those decisions have consequences." He looked at her. "But he's not going to be hurt, if that's what you're asking." She thought about Caleb in the chair under the work light, the fear in his face before he saw her, the reflex of a man reaching for control even with nothing left to reach with. "He's not worth protecting," she said. "I know that. I'm not asking you to protect him." She looked at her hands on the diner table. "I just don't want his damage to be the last thing I carry from this." Lucian said, "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't want to spend the next 2 years of my life knowing that what happened to him happened because of me," she said. "Even if he deserved it, even if he caused all of it." She paused. That's not mercy. It's maintenance. I worked too hard to put that weight down. Lucian looked at her for a long time. He'll be released, he said. The debt restructures. He pays it over time, through work I'll designate, legitimate work, nothing that puts him back in a room like tonight. He paused. That's the extent of it. That's enough, Elara said. 3 weeks later, Caleb Voss accepted a position as a financial consultant for a property management firm on the North Shore that had been quietly recommended to him through channels he didn't ask about. The salary was enough to begin servicing his restructured debt. He moved into an apartment in Evanston and began, by all available evidence, the careful and unglamorous work of becoming a smaller and less consequential version of himself. He did not contact Elara. She noticed his absence the way you notice the absence of a sound you've been hearing so long it became part of the background. A change in the texture of silence rather than a sound itself. After 2 weeks, she stopped noticing. The LLC was registered on a Tuesday morning in late November under the name Meridian Structural Consulting, LLC, with a stated purpose in business advisory services and a registered agent whose name was not Elara's, and an office address that was a legitimate suite in a building on LaSalle Street. Her name appeared as managing partner. She signed the documents with the pen she used to sign all her documents, a medium-weight ballpoint that she had carried for 3 years because she had learned early that pens that wrote consistently were worth keeping. She called Naomi that afternoon. The call lasted 47 minutes. Naomi asked questions that were good questions, the kind that a person who genuinely knows you asks when they want to understand rather than judge. Elara answered most of them. Not all of them. Some of the answers belonged to structures that didn't include Naomi yet, and she said so. And Naomi, who had known her long enough to know what yet meant coming from Elara, accepted it. Are you happy? Naomi said, near the end. Elara thought about the question honestly. She was standing at the window of her apartment, her own apartment, same place, same 12-minute cab ride from everything, same lamp and same couch and same view of the building across the street, and the November light was doing the thing it did in this city where it arrived sideways and cold and somehow still beautiful. I'm different, she said. I'm something I wasn't 3 months ago. I don't know yet if that's the same as happy. Is it better? Naomi said. Elara looked out the window at the sideways light. Yes, she said. It's better. Disappeared. The first time she went to the Devereaux building after everything, it was for a meeting. An actual meeting. Lucian, Marcus, a lawyer named Devlin, who communicated in complete paragraphs and said nothing twice, and Elara with a folder of documents that needed reviewing before Meridian's first formal engagement. The meeting lasted an hour and a half and was entirely professional and covered 3 agenda items and concluded with decisions that were documented and distributed before she left the building. She was in the elevator going down when her phone rang. The building's number. She answered. The meeting ran long, Lucian said. It ran exactly as long as it needed to. You have somewhere to be. I have a lunch. She paused. Naomi. A brief silence. The accountant. The friend, Elara said. From the firm, yes. Right. Another silence, and in that silence was a quality she had learned to read over the last month. Not awkwardness, Lucian did not do awkwardness, but the specific hesitation of a man who was choosing his words not because he was uncertain of them, but because he wanted them to land correctly. There's a place on Dearborn, he said. Thursday. If you're not committed. She looked at her reflection in the elevator doors. The woman looking back at her had concrete dust on her knees in her memory, and a pen in her bag and her name on a document that had been signed on a Tuesday morning in November, and meant she was part of something she had walked into through a service exit at a hotel on a night she had meant to prove she was fine. She was not fine in the way she had meant it then. She was something considerably more complicated than fine. Thursday, she said. What time? 7. I'll be there at 7:15, she said. The elevator opened on the lobby. She walked through it without looking at the security desk, where a woman named Priya had come back to work 2 days after the building incident with the bruise faded to yellow at the edges and a new efficiency about how she handled the morning visitor log. Alara had brought her coffee on the first day back. Priya had accepted it without making it into anything, which was its own kind of grace. She pushed through the revolving door and the December air hit her. Proper winter now, the kind that announced itself, that came in from the lake with the full weight of the season behind it. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the building, and then at the street, and then at the sky, which was the particular shade of gray that Chicago did in December when it was serious about winter. She thought, this is where you are now. Not as a verdict, not as a warning, just as a fact, the kind she had been trained to work with, the kind you document and verify and build from. She started walking. 6 months later, the city that had swallowed her whole had learned a different version of her name. Not famous. She was not interested in famous. Famous was a kind of exposure she had no use for, a visibility that served no structure she was trying to build. But in the specific rooms where specific things were decided, the conversations that happened over dinners that didn't appear in any calendar, the phone calls between people whose names didn't appear in any public filing, the agreements that needed a certain kind of architecture to hold their shape. In those rooms, the name Whitmore had acquired a weight that hadn't been there before. She was good at this. She had always been good at it. What was different now was that she knew it, not as a performance of confidence, but as a settled fact she had tested under conditions that left no room for self-deception. Meridian Structural Consulting took on 3 clients in its first quarter, 2 of them through channels that had nothing to do with Lucian, which was by design. She had insisted on it, not for appearances, but because a structure that depended entirely on one relationship was not a structure, it was an extension, and she was not interested in being an extension of anyone. Lucian understood this without being told. That was something she was still adjusting to. How much he understood without being told. How much he had observed and filed and held without requiring her to perform her reasoning for him. They had dinner on Thursday. They had dinner again the following Tuesday because he called and she answered, and neither of them performed a great deal of deliberation about it. By the end of January, it had become a pattern that they did not discuss and did not need to, and the pattern had its own shape and weight, and she let it. She did not move into the building on North Wabash. She kept her apartment and her lamp and her view of the building across the street and the lunch table by the window at the firm where the light was still better on that side. She was not an extension. She was a woman who had run from a man who spent 4 years teaching her to make herself small and had run directly into the most complicated possible alternative and had discovered in the space between those two things a version of herself she had not known existed, harder than she thought, smarter than she had been told, capable of standing in a room full of men who believed she was a pawn and making herself into the thing that held the board together. That discovery did not come without cost. She understood that. The LLC on LaSalle Street had her name on it, and the things it held in its structure were not things she could unknow or unlearn or step back from into the ordinary sequence of days she had imagined when she left Caleb Voss 2 years ago, with her bags packed and the elevator taking too long. The cost was real. She looked at it clearly, the way she looked at everything now, like directly, with both eyes, without the consolation of telling herself it was smaller than it was. And she decided as clearly and directly as she had decided anything, that what she had become in the pain of it was worth what it had cost. Not because the math was clean. The math was not clean. It was the kind of arithmetic that required assumptions that couldn't be verified, and outcomes that couldn't be predicted, and variables that were still resolving. But she had always been good at working with incomplete information. She had always known how to build a structure that held. On a Tuesday morning in March, she arrived at the office on LaSalle Street at 8:15, which was her standard time, and she hung her coat on the hook behind the door, which was her standard hook. And she sat down at the desk and opened the folder for the day's first review, and the light came through the window the way light does in Chicago in March. Cautious, still figuring out the season, arriving at an angle that meant it was trying, she pressed her pen to the first page. She began,